in Wisconsin. My name is Jane Anklam and I'll be your moderator today. Today's program is the second of 3 webinars. Next Thursday, April 8th, Margaret Crome and from Michael Fields Agricultural Institute and Sarah Whaling, Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection will cover emerging federal and state policy around agriculture and climate. After that, we will send an evaluation to everyone who is registered for the webinars, and based on your feedback, we'll decide whether to organize further professional development on this topic. A few logistics, please check that you are muted. We are recording today's webinar. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat feature. At the end of the presentation, Carolyn Eady of our UW-Madison Division of Extension agriculture educator for Richland and Crawford County will share the questions in the chat. And then time permitting, we will ask you to unmute so you can ask additional questions. Our speakers have graciously agreed to stay on a bit longer if there are still questions after our hour. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jay Arbuckle. Jay is a professor of sociology and chair of the graduate program in sustainable agriculture at Iowa State University. His research and extension efforts focus on improving the environmental and social performance of agricultural systems, with a main area of interest in the drivers of farmer and agricultural stakeholder decision-making and actions related to soil and water quality and adaptation to climate change. Jay, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm always excited to share research with our extension colleagues across the region. I try to share my screen here and see if it works. You can see the presentation screen?
Very good.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. All right, well, I'll just dive right in if I can get this to start working. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about social science research on farmers and climate change. I've been doing research on farmers and climate change since about 2011, so about 10 years now, and I've done mostly in Iowa, but also across the region, including Wisconsin. And I'll share a little bit of information from. I'll mostly be talking about information from Iowa, but also from across the Corn Belt region. So, we all know that climate change poses threats to agriculture and will require adaptation and mitigation by farmers. I took a look at the presentations that were given at the last session, and I see that the presenters really covered a lot of those. But I'll be talking a little bit about how farmers perceive the threats to agriculture and what they might do about it. And so just a very basic behavioral model that we, the social scientists, often look at when we look at behavioral change in agriculture. We look at, particularly when we're talking about climate change, we look at the relationships between beliefs and attitudes and risk perceptions and behavior change. And so one of the questions that we've been asking over the last decade or so is, what do farmers and other key stakeholders believe about climate change? Number one. Number two, are they concerned about climate change and potential impacts? And number three, do they support action? That is, do they think they should change the way they farm in response to climate change and its impacts? And also, do they think that we at universities and other stakeholders like farm groups and government agencies should help them to change the way they farm or adapt or mitigate? And perspectives on mitigation and adaptation policies and programs. And finally, the behavior change part: are they adapting? Are they maladapting? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research, both qualitative and quantitative research that I've been working on, and I'll draw on some other research efforts from across the region. But primarily, I'll focus on 2 major research efforts on farmers and climate change. One being, well, there was a project that I worked on for 6 years that was called we call it the Sustainable Corn Project, but there was also the Cropping Systems Coordinated Agricultural Project that was funded by USDA NIFA. It was a partnership. Well, we did a survey, which was a partnership with a project out of Purdue led by Linda Prokope, who's a great friend of mine. We did a large-scale survey of farmers, about 5,000 farmers across the Corn Belt region, larger scale corn farmers. And then we also did in-depth interviews with 160 farmers across the region. And then the other, what I'm actually going to share, most of the data that I'm going to share with you today comes from the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll, which is an annual survey of about 1,000 Iowa farmers. And I'm going to share with you, it's also a longitudinal survey, so it surveys the same farmers year after year. And we've put climate change questions in 2011, 2013, and 2020. And so we can kind of track changes in climate change perspectives over time. Okay, so what have we learned in the last decade about what farmers think about climate change and what they're doing about it? I'll start with beliefs. This is a chart that has 3 years of farm poll data and data from the corn cap, the CS cap project that I talked about. So you can see on the left-hand side of this graph, this is a bar chart of climate beliefs that range from the bottom there in that dark blue, that's climate change is occurring and mostly human causes. Then there's climate change is occurring equally natural and human. Then climate change is occurring mostly natural. And then there's the purple is insufficient evidence to determine whether it's happening or not. And then the top, the little sliver of light blue at the top is climate change is not occurring. So you can see, if you look from left to right, you can really see that the bottom 3 kind of sections of the bar chart are belief that climate change is happening. And that has increased from, particularly among the Iowa farmers, from about 68%, 67% in 2011 to 81% in 2020, which is a pretty substantial increase over time. So what we're finding is that most farmers believe that climate change is happening. However, a minority believe that it's primarily due to human activity. So pretty small percentage of farmers, their beliefs align with the scientific consensus with climate change, about climate change, but beliefs are changing over time, so they are not static. Second area that we looked at, that we've been looking at, is perceived risks. And these next slides really look at kind of general perceived risks. And so a couple items we've put in to the Farm and Rural Life Poll over time is extreme weather events will be more frequent. And these are on an agreement scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I'm presenting percent agree or strongly agree here. So this extreme weather events will become more frequent in the future. Back in 2011, 46% of farmers agreed with that. In 2020, 50% agreed with that. So a small increase up to from 46 to 50%. The item I'm concerned about, potential impacts of climate change on my farm, however, increased quite a bit from 35% agreement in 2011 to 51% agreement in 2020. So a pretty substantial increase in generalized perceived risks there. Another couple of, this is kind of the flip side of perceived risks. This is belief that crop insurance and other programs will protect my farm operations revenue there on the left-hand side. Back in 2011, was the first time we asked that question, 46% of farmers agreed with that. In 2020, just 33% agreed with that. So that's a pretty strong drop in those kind of the faith in crop insurance and other similar programs to be a safety net to cope with climate change. And then the other one is kind of what we call human exemptionalism. Farmers kind of generalized faith in human ingenuity to get us out of any predicament. So climate change is not a big issue because human ingenuity will enable us to adapt to changes. Back in 2011, 33% of farmers agreed with that statement, and that's down to 21%. So about a fifth, from about a third of farmers to about a fifth of farmers. So this, taken together, those two slides of kind of generalized perceived risk shows that over time, concern is increasing. We've also been asking about specific perceived risks, and this is just the 2020 data, and you can see I've got a couple there that are about heat stress and drought, a couple in there about crop disease and insect and weed pressure, and 3 in there about kind of water related items. And you can see that, we're on a scale there of up to 90%, and almost all of them are 70% either concerned or very concerned or higher about all of these. And so I was, looking at, is it Dr. Kaczarik's presentation from the last session, the last webinar on this? I mean, these are the, and the other presenter, I can't remember his name, Vitone. Anyway, they laid out, these are the kinds of impacts that we're going to be seeing increasing in the upper Midwest. And as you can see, farmers in Iowa, at least, are quite concerned about them. We also look at attitudes toward various potential actions that can be taken to adapt to climate change and its impacts. So, various things that various actors can do. So we see that faith or support for private sector action. For example, seed companies should develop crop varieties adapted to coming changes. A good 2/3 of farmers agreed with that. Over time, there's kind of an upward swing in 2013 and about 64% there in 2020. University extension should help farmers to prepare for for impacts of climate change there. You see about 33% agreed with that in 2011 and about 35% in 2020. So that's been pretty stable, around a third. Same with state agencies, a little bit of an increase there from 24% agreement that state agencies should help farmers to prepare for increased precipitation, up to 33% in 2020. And then I added a new item in 2020 asking farmers if they plan to use more conservation practices to increase their farm's resilience to extreme weather, and slightly over half of farmers agreed with that statement. So a lot of support, particularly for private sector action and then individual action, but not as much, at least for these questions about extension and state agencies. Let me ask a few questions about attitudes toward mitigation action. So these, as you might anticipate, garnered quite a bit less agreement. So government should do more to reduce the nation's greenhouse gas emissions and other potential causes of climate change, which of course, it kind of smacks of regulation. But, I was actually surprised that even back in 2011, 33% farmers agreed with this. And then in 2020, it had increased to 39%. And then in 2013, for the first time, I asked or put the item out there, I should reduce greenhouse gas emissions from my farm operation. That was 27% in 2013 and 26% in 2020. So that kind of attitudes toward individual level action on GHGs kind of remain the same. A couple of new questions this last year in 2020 I put in as we've been talking about how agriculture might adapt to and help to mitigate climate change. We've been asking, there's been talk of various policies. One area that we've talked about is figuring out how to develop profitable markets and programs that support the planting of biomass, particularly perennial biomass, as a way to reduce vulnerability and potentially capture carbon. And so this item, profitable markets for biomass, should be developed to encourage planting of perennial crops, grasses and trees on vulnerable land. We had 27% agreement with that statement, 35% uncertain, and 38% disagreeing. So, a little over a third disagreeing, and a little bit of about 2/3 either agreeing or being uncertain. I tend to look at the uncertain as in a kind of a glass half full way, potentially open to the possibility of such a policy or program. Then I put an item in about mitigation policy. Of course, the Biden administration has been talking quite a bit about this as Secretary Vilsack has stepped back into the secretary role. Programs and/or markets for carbon capture should be developed to help farmers earn money from adopting practices that capture greenhouse gases. And so we see about 32% agreement with that, about 48% of farmers uncertain, and 20% disagreement. So this kind of tells me that there's quite a bit of potential openness to the development of such programs, which is interesting because there's a lot of effort going into thinking about these possibilities. And then into the behavior side of things. So this last year, we asked about different kinds of adaptive actions that farmers may have taken in response to recent weather variability and its impacts. I think, yeah. So in the last 10 years, the question was, have you made any changes to the following types of management operations in response to weather variability and its impacts? And provided a long laundry list of different kinds of actions that farmers might take. The top in terms of adaptive actions that farmers have said, so we basically had a scale that's from decrease to increase, and so Iowa farmers indicated that whether this is just a graph of moderate increase or major increase. So scouting for pests and disease, you can see that 38% indicated moderate and 14% major increase. Then use of no-till has increased. Growing season application of nitrogen, like side dress during season, has increased. Ostensibly to reduce nutrient loss from that comes with fall application of nitrogen, for example. Then increase in structural infield practices like terraces and contour buffers. Use of cover crops has increased, and structural edge of field practices like riparian buffers has also increased. So that is, a pretty, I guess, heartening finding that farmers are really perceiving and understanding and actually experiencing, of course, the impacts of climate change, and they're taking proactive changes to adapt. On the other side of the coin, we have what I'll call maladaptive actions. I think the couple of the presenters from last time talked about, for example, installation of agricultural drainage as an adaptive practice. Now, it is an adaptive practice, right? Because farmers are installing drainage at a pretty high clip across the Corn Belt to deal with the increased precipitation and the size of rain events to try to move that water off the fields. So that is adaptive at the field level, right? But if you think about it at the landscape level, it can be maladaptive because we can be moving, more water off, which oftentimes comes with nutrients. And so that, you can see that that was the largest or the highest level of behavior change in this set of maladaptive actions. Another really big one is use of pesticides. So you can see that, about a third of farmers indicate that over the last 10 years, they've increased their use of pesticides in response to increased weather variability and its impacts. Fall net application of nitrogen fertilizer has increased to some degree, and tillage has also increased. Another area we looked at is what we call self-efficacy, or basically confidence in capacity to adapt. We've got two items here. One is, I have the knowledge and technical skill to deal with any weather-related threats to the viability of my farm operation. And as you can see, about 32% agreed with that, about 48% uncertain, and just 20% disagreed. And if you look at the next one, it's, I have the financial capacity to deal with any weather-related threats to the viability of my farm operation. And there's quite a bit more disagreement there. So 38% disagreeing, 35% uncertain, and just 27% agreeing. So I think this is really an important comparison, because although farmers may believe they have the knowledge and technical skill to deal with climate change related threats, they may not have the financial wherewithal. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that later on. Now, this is where I think it's really important for all of us to recognize, and think about who farmers trust for climate change information, because of course we're in the extension business. We're in the business of moving information from research to the field, to our clients and stakeholders. And so I pose this question, thinking about the following agencies, organizations, and groups: how much do you trust or distrust them as sources of information about climate change and its potential impacts? And as you can see, the red there is distrust and the green is trust. Extension rose to the top. And this is 2011, so 10 years ago. And so that was quite heartening. Scientists were also right there, number 2, and farm groups was number 3. So that was I wasn't sure what to anticipate, but I was heartened to find this. When I first started developing this question set, people were telling me, well, farmers are probably just paying attention to radio talk show hosts, conservative radio, AM radio, and that's probably where they get their information. And the reality is that radio talk show hosts was pretty much dead last, tied with mainstream news media in terms of who they trust. So that's 2011, and fast forward to 2021. Oh, I want to point out before I go to 2021, kind of in the middle there is term conservation organizations. There was about a third trusted, a third neutral, and a third distrusted. So in 2021, I put the same question out there and asked, just had the same set. I added a couple of actors, but the same set of actors. University Extension again rose to the top, even stronger levels of trust. So the trust went from 53% to 60%, which is good to see, of course, as an extension professional. That's what I like to see. Another important, so I changed the conservation organizations question. I added soil and water to the beginning because we had conservation organizations and environmental organizations. And in talking to some farmers, I realize that there may be some confusion. There may be that some farmers, when they think conservation, they think, Sierra Club or, some kind of Greenpeace or something like that, which, in many farmers' minds, those are environmental organizations. And as you can see, environmental organizations are far down the list. So I added soil and water, and sure enough, that bumped up to the top. So we're talking about, Natural Resources Conservation Service and soil and water conservation districts primarily. And they're number 2 now, tied with scientists, and then farm groups not far behind. So really, kind of and agricultural retailers, so these are the stakeholders so Extension is the most trusted, but then the stakeholders that Extension works with quite a bit are also trusted. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Oh, and so continuing on the theme of trust, this is from a survey that Linda Prokopi and the U2U project, which is kind of a sister project to the Corn Cap, did of different kinds of ag advisors in the Corn Belt, and asked them, and this is primarily ag retailers, asked them who they trust the most using the same question set. And again, among those advisors that farmers look to, Extension and scientists rose to the top. So just to kind of add a little bit of a little bit more information to that, the importance of Extension as a source of climate change information. One more trust question. This is a question that I put in the 2014 Iowa Farm and Real Life poll. This is, which group do you trust the most for information to help you make decisions about dealing with extreme weather? Again, ISU Extension or Extension rose to the top, followed by Natural Resource Conservation Service or Soil and Water Conservation District. So I think, taken together, those various data points really point to the importance of Extension as a climate change information source that's trusted by farmers. So now I'm going to take a breath and talk a little bit about some qualitative research that we collected, or some qualitative research that we conducted with the Corn Cap project. We did 159 in-depth interviews across the Corn Belt with farmers. So we had their diverse group of farmers. They're primarily kind of extension clients, so folks that our extension specialists had some relationship with. We really just explored themes associated with climate change beliefs, adaptation strategies, and perceived risks. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about climate change beliefs, and this is kind of a representative quote that expresses some of the uncertainty. So as you saw from the belief slide, that uncertainty and human and nature, or mostly natural, being the causes of climate change, were one of the most important, largest categories. And here's kind of a quote that represents that. Well, I guess my thought on climate change is it's always going to be changing. I mean, there are glaciers here at one point, and at the moment, we're pretty glad they're gone. That's a big change. So we just have to be adaptable. I mean, if the weather changes, you just have to be proactive, I think, and looking forward rather than backwards to try to do everything you can to minimize risk and still grow a crop. And so that's the kind of thing that we heard over and over again. A couple motivations for adapting. I mean, there are a lot of citing of extreme weather events and the kind of risk perceptions. Here are a couple quotes from Iowa farmers. Greater variability in our weather than perhaps we've experienced over the last 50 to 100 years. While we don't know exactly what's going to happen, some of these extreme events give us a signal we need to plan our rotations and our practices to build that resiliency into the soil. And one of the worst times in this area is like when the ground is froze and we can get a big rain, and the cover crops are peace of mind for that. So really kind of adapting through cover crops and other practices to extreme weather events. Here's another one. Well, we had a neighbor that used to put rye on corn he chopped, and I kind of laughed. But then we had a winter where the frost went out the first part of February, and the top 2 inches thawed out, and then we had a heavy rain, and it started washing where there was nothing. I didn't laugh anymore. I was like, we have to do something. So that's how we got started. And then soil health came up a lot in these interviews. We weren't asking specifically about soil health, but a lot of farmers talked about soil health as their motivations for adaptation. So here's one. The oats would die over the winter itself, so you don't have to spend any money on killing it in the spring. And we have a lot less washing after we seed the oats. So you get more microbial activity when you have the oats in there. The ground is nice and mellow, and it's nice to plant in, so you're going to get a yield boost from it. So that's part of the process too. Okay, so I'm just going to end up with just a few kind of summary statements about what I think we've really learned from farmers over the last 10 years. Number one, they're diverse in their perspectives on climate change and what should be done. You know, beliefs are diverse and attitudes toward adaptation are diverse. And y'all probably all work with farmers, so you know that. But another important thing is that those beliefs and perceived risks are changing over time, and level of concern is definitely increasing as we're seeing, you know, more extreme rain events, more extreme weather events. Farmers' beliefs are changing, and their level of concern is changing, and they're also becoming more supportive of different kind of adaptations, and they're actually increasing adaptive management. However, we also have a lot of farmers that are employing maladaptive practices at the same time. And it's kind of something that we have to think about. How do we balance that? A couple more important points. There's a lot of farmers who are confident that they'll be able to adapt. You know, that's what farmers do. I mean, being a farmer is all about adaptation to what Mother Nature dishes out to you. So there is a lot of confidence that they can adapt. However, you know, there's certain kinds of extreme weather that you just cannot adapt to, right? Derechos and 5-inch rains. It's just it's nigh impossible with like a corn soybean rotation, right? And so there's a lot of uncertainty, and then a lot of farmers believe that they, you know, lack the technical and especially financial resources. I think the data point to the fact that farmers would like some support. They're definitely more supportive of extension in private sector than state or federal government, and definitely trust extension more, right? And then, you know, a lot of support, you know, those 2 policy questions that I put in there. Many support or at least open to those adaptation and mitigation policies and programs to create carbon and ecosystem services markets. So just a couple of closing thoughts. Farmers are adapting, but could use a hand. You know, one of the good things, of course, is that we're working on it. Land grants, extension, and public agencies, we're all working hard to help farmers to incorporate more resilience enhancing practices. Another key point is those same practices and systems that increase resilience, like extended rotations, no-till cover crops, also, you know, have off-farm benefits like water quality and potentially greenhouse gas emissions reduction or even carbon capture. But, you know, I think we need to put even more emphasis on getting more and more diverse practices and especially diverse cropping systems on the ground. You know, I think that it can't be emphasized more that, you know, extension and soil and water conservation agencies and scientists are the most trusted sources of climate change information. So we really need to keep providing that science-based information on climate change and work toward alignment with scientific consensus on climate change. And try to, you know, it's hard to talk to farmers about climate change. It makes people nervous, right? Because you know that there's going to be some farmers in the room that either don't believe climate change is happening or don't believe it's anthropogenic. But I think, we do need to make an effort to keep our eye on the science and keep working toward alignment with scientific consensus and the facts. But, I think one of the most important things, and probably the most important thing really, is how to overcome the economic pressures of commodity production. Is it through carbon and ecosystem services, markets and payments? Is it through new crops and markets that allow extended rotations and more diversified systems? Anything, right now, since forever, the pursuit of the ever decreasing margin on commodities and the boom bust commodity cycle makes it exceedingly difficult to do anything different from like your typical corn, soybean, well, in Iowa, corn, soybean, and in Wisconsin, you have a much more diverse system. But to do anything different than kind of the status quo is really hard. And so we have to think pretty seriously about how we can overcome those economic pressures and help farmers to overcome them. And it could be new markets and new policies that will develop those markets. Actually, and so that's it. I think we might have time for a question or two. I'm sorry I went over a couple minutes there, I think.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much.
That's fine.
There's a lot to chew on there. So, and I'm glad we got a little bit of time here for questions. Carolyn, I wonder if you have a couple there.
I do have a couple of questions, and I know that they came on early in the presentation, so maybe we can tie a couple of them together. But was there a specific reason for selecting the years to ask about climate change on the survey?
That is an excellent question. It's a long answer, but the shortish answer is I had plans to ask climate change questions in 2017. I mean, so the Farm and Rural Life Poll, I work a lot with stakeholders to work questions in that respond to kind of issues on the ground. And so like I wanted to ask some questions in 2015 and it didn't work out, didn't have space. Then 2017, I was getting ready to ask some questions, and then the National Agricultural Statistics Service, who used to do the survey for us, was nervous given the incoming administration that we should not ask about climate change because their incoming administration was antagonistic to the idea of anthropogenic climate change. And so they basically didn't allow us to ask climate change questions. So that and some other things instigated a shift away from working with NASA. Now we actually do this last year, 2020 was the first year we did the survey in-house at Iowa State. So now I can ask all of the climate change questions that I want. So that's I was trying to do it in kind of a couple, a more regular fashion, but politics got in the way.
Okay, and the second question is a reasonably low 33% to attitudes towards extension helping farmers with climate adaptation versus seed companies being looked to for assistance. Saying that later on that they trust us a lot, why do they think the seed companies are the answer?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I've thought about that some. I think, the seed company question, that's kind of easy button, right? That's something that farmers, we always want. I mean, not just farmers, but a lot of us, we want the technological fix, right? And so I think they're quite, and that's kind of an obvious fix. And I think the extension one is a little less obvious because maybe farmers don't know exactly how extension can help them. And, maybe we don't know exactly, at least back then when I asked that question, maybe didn't know exactly how we could help them as well. But I think the main thing is the trust, as you mentioned. It's, we have their trust, and so it's just a matter of figuring out how to work with them to increase that resilience and, hopefully work toward more adaptation and also, carbon sequestration if we can, and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you. I think we'll hold the questions now we'll have a section at the end as well, and you can keep typing them in the chat or save them and we'll unmute you later. And then Carolyn is going to open up our fabulous post-demographic poll. You can see it on your screen and select the answers. We'll move through that. And as you're completing the poll, I'd like to introduce our next section in light of what we just heard Dr. Arbuckle say. Thank you very much. We have invited 3 local educators who will briefly share how they've engaged farmers and agriculture-related community members in climate change discussions. As we do so, you may want to consider your own experiences. I'm sure they're varied in how climate change communication in your area over the past several years. I will share first. I'm with Douglas County, then Mike Ballweg County, and our Gene Schriefer from Iowa County. Okay. So my programming for climate change in relation to agriculture up in the Superior Basin, the northwest part of the state, has been embedded with in science of mostly soil management, soil health, and nutrient management programming. These sessions are offered over maybe, let's say, the past 10 years. I'm kind of looking at that window. And what I have done is sharing either a very brief, simple PowerPoint with slides, or maybe just a slide or two that display the trends in Wisconsin climate as collected during the first wiki report. The earlier versions as described by Dan Weima and Chris Kucharik from last week's session. So what was the information that we had within the last 10 years compared to what we have now. I also include examples of conventional conservation practices that we've all grown to know and love, but are now becoming more substantiated with some of our research that we're doing on climate adaptation values. So the same practices, but looking at them in a little different lens during our conversations. In this setting of place with groups of peers, field days and such, the farmers can consider what they see in their experience, and they can share it with their friends and neighbors, and they have the additional confidence of university research that's being offered and discussed at the same program. University research, which is neutral, isn't one side or the other, it's simply research. So there isn't, they can use it to inform their discussions on their own and some of their decisions. I must add that I have followed some of Jay's research on the social conceptions across the Corn Belt, which included, as he had mentioned, a partnership that UW Agronomy Department through Joe Lauer's Corn Agronomy program were able to be a part of, in terms of some of our farmers were interviewed and were part of that program. So that always rings true when you talk about that with farmers. And then the second connection that I wanted to bring up or encourage you to become familiar with is through your local county comprehensive plans, your soil and water plans, your farmland preservation plans, and your hazard mitigation plans. All of those, I'm sure you're familiar with in one way or another. And it's if you can encourage or request or serve as an advisor on some of those planning initiatives, that's very informative. I served on the initial Douglas County Comprehensive Plan 10 years ago, and now we're in the review. And in part of the updates, you can see how they've changed. And now the plans are starting to incorporate climate policies and actions. That's being encouraged across the state. And some counties are taking it up differently. So what happens is they really appreciate when somebody from the university with research-based information can help them develop their objectives and policies to make them more tangible in their planning efforts. Let's see. When they have science-based information, they can rely on these plans better. Their local leaders can use them with confidence, and they can share them with their funders that way. I don't suspect that everyone would be attending these types of sessions, but I do encourage you to grab those plans and sit down with them and look to see how they're talking about climate under the agriculture element, the land use element, and the natural resource element. It gives you a reflection on what they could use from extension in those situations. So anyway, these two examples are not extraordinary steps. I'm not at the point of measuring change, but certainly more awareness and consideration. Changes up here in the Superior Basin are pretty spectacular in terms of our nighttime temperatures and our winter temperatures, even compared with the rest of the state. Several states of emergency for flood water velocity and loss of infrastructure have occurred in the Superior Basin. So there is a captive audience to speak to, and they do want that information. With that, I will turn it over to Mike Ballweg to share his examples.
Thanks, Jane. Am I coming through well?
Very good.
All right, sounds good. Mike Ballweg. I'm Extension Crops and Soils in Sheboygan County, and work also supporting some of the work in neighboring counties. I think, as most everybody online knows, it's an area of the state that we've had extremely well. We have heavy soils, and the sort of time frame that I reference as I make these comments today is probably within the last 6 to 8 years, when we've experienced unusually wet, heavy precipitation, significant rain events, etc. So I was asked to think about how we can best incorporate climate change topics into our ongoing extension programming. And I guess I'd start by just saying I think it's a long-term process to continually build the awareness. I think our programming efforts need to be steady and ongoing. I look for opportunities to try and connect the long-term climate data to our local conditions. And there's a local program here. I call it the Agronomy Day. I've been doing it for more than a couple of decades. So well attended, and it's sort of created its own identity as an extension educational program. But that's been one of the platforms where I've been able to incorporate climate change data and information. For example, I think it was 3 years ago now, I invited Dr. Ed Hopkins, who is the assistant state climatologist, to the meeting. And generally, this meeting has a very sort of mainstream egg production focus and flavor, and that's generally what people are sort of looking for and comfortable with. But I try to weave in some of these other topics. So Dr. Hopkins that day just did a great job in about 45 minutes. And his assignment was, has weather in Wisconsin really changed in the last 50 years? And if you look at the data, you would say, yes, it has. So building some connections there. And then, taking that next step, and, Jay had mentioned this, programming focused on adapting the practices to the seasonal weather or the climate changes that we're experiencing. And one very significant one, and it really happened quickly, has to do with the number of times that we would make in applications to corn. If Jay, in this part of the country, we don't do fall in applications, but we would generally put down all of our N just right at planting or just right before planting. And there, with a number of years being very wet, not to anyone's surprise, everybody was buying their nitrogen twice. So in just 1 year in Little Sheboygan County, there were like, a half a dozen Y drop systems purchased. The local co-ops, purchased some spreaders, high-boy type spreaders, so they could drive through the cornfields. But so I think that was one example. And and I'm not trying to take more credit for this than I should, and I'm not. It's pretty hard to make the connections because there's a lot of people involved making these things work. But so it's mostly what people saw on their farm and realizing that, okay, they needed to make some adjustments to how they were applying nitrogen to their corn. So I established the sort of, okay, this is what's going on. Now, what do we need to do? And when you can build those relationships, those connections, I think farmers are much more, they sort of begin to understand and maybe accept that, yeah, there's something going on with the weather. And I think most of them would. Again, like Jay said, they know something is different. Again, another change is in the use of alternative forages in eastern Wisconsin. Again, heavy soils. Alfalfa stands have really struggled the last 6 or 8 years. People are planting different kinds of forages, and we continue to program in that area, and in fact, expand our programming in alternative forages. So it's also the dairy industry part of the state. I never had to think about managing prevent plant acres, probably until about 10 or 15 years ago. It was just like, it didn't seem to ever be an issue. But in more recent years, again, 6, 8 years, something like that, we've had to talk about cover crops. What are we going to do with these prevent plant acres? Are we going to spray them? Are we going to kill them numerous times over the summer? Are we going to plant a cover crop? So we've also had to deal with, while the growing season is getting longer, the reality is that because of delayed plantings, wet soil conditions, the growing season has actually gotten shorter some years. And then lastly, the adjustments, the impacts, conservation practices around soil health, water infiltration, no-till, again, cover crops and those kinds of things. So that's sort of been my approach. And it's always, a little bit, working in some of these topics along with what I would call the more, traditional or mainstay agronomic topics. And I've had some success with pretty good, participation and attendance. So, and then when we as educators and outreach specialists have an opportunity, and we sit on committees, we sit on boards to plant some ideas about incorporating climate change, adaptation practices into some of these regional and statewide programs. Sometimes they might not even come up, but if we're at the table, make some suggestions that can sometimes help keep the topic a little more front and center. So I'll stop there. I probably used my time. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Gene, can you help us?
I see you made me go last and only gave me 5 minutes. That's probably a good thing.
There you go.
Similar to Mike and Jane, I've been trying to incorporate some ideas on climate change and mitigation or adaptation into existing program. I haven't yet hit this head on, although my spring 2020 grazing conference was actually on climate change impacts on grazing systems, which happened to fall right as we all got sent home for COVID. So I never didn't complete that program. But my foray into this began in 2012, our last large drought year, and a good crisis is a good teachable moment. And immediately that fall, started talking about how we can make pasture systems more resilient to hot weather, dry weather, the conditions that we saw in 2012. And I've continued to incorporate that idea into workshops, pasture walks, field days, focusing on soil health, building soil, organic matter, grazing management, et cetera, and talking about how we need to be able to improve our ability to harvest and store water because of what we're observing for changes in weather patterns, larger, more intense rainstorm events, and the impacts of flooding on those. We also, or myself and our CRD agent at the time, set up a series of 3 community information sessions on climate change. We had support from our emergency management coordinator, and then also our county highway commissioner, which was surprising and good to see. And we involved some of our extension specialists. David Liebel, who's now retired, came out. We also had Sherry Gruder, who is on today or was on earlier. I think I saw her name. Came out, and it was just a conversation about what does the science say? What are we observing? What are we measuring? And then what are some ideas of things that we can do? And it was a community conversation. I'd say looking back, we got that 22% of people that thought it was human induced and it is occurring. So we wound up with the choir, maybe not the people that were sitting on the fence that needed some support to go either way. But that was, we have tried some specific things here in the southwest part of the state. I'd say most of what I do is conversations one-on-one with people. Those are easier to have, or for me, I find them easier to have because they've got a specific topic or question that they've got. And, you know, if they're not in a group, they're a little bit more open to that conversation, even if we don't necessarily agree. But I like the approach of thinking about risk management, especially in terms of weather risk and how we can maybe adapt what we're doing or how we're doing it, trying to encourage more no-till, get more cover crops on the ground. And it's you know, what are people seeing themselves here in the southwest part of the state? You know, we have a large rainfall event. When Mike had prevent planting, that was our best yielding corn ever that year. We had so much moisture, and of course in southwest Wisconsin, it all runs off. So it soaks in, the rest runs off. We can let it dry for a day or two and we plant. We had record yields that year when other parts of the state weren't able to get anything into the ground. But we also have these intense flooding events where you know, a 4-foot wall of water will come out of the hills and take out communities and field crops that are planted, and we're seeing that with greater frequency. And those are the things that farmers easily see, they can relate to, and I guess my goal has always just been to try and talk to them where they are, of what they can see and what they can do. We have developed some things, some infographics that I've sent out to our townships on externalized costs caused by flooding and how certain ag practices can help mitigate those. I'm work with the Perennial Forage Working Group on the Green Lands, Blue Waters project run through the University of Minnesota. And we've been, again, having more conversations about some of these externalized costs and how changing our ag system will help us all in the long term. And I think Jay's comment about we're not really looking at how we can change the system, and there's parts of it that we might need to think about how we can do differently. So I think that was my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Gene. That was enlightening for us. Thank you guys for sharing, and for everybody sitting out there thinking of examples that you've tried, and using Jay's talk as a background to how we talk with our communities and our farmers on that. I believe Carolyn maybe has a few questions in the chat, and then we will open it up to open mic questions as well.
Very good. I'm fighting some unstable internet, so I hope I don't cut out. But how much do you think state and/or federal financial programs supporting ag climate resiliency practices would tip the balance to farmers being more proactive to adapting them? And I think this question is for you, Jay.
Yeah, so I think that's like Gene's kind of to build on Gene's point. I mean, something we spend a lot of money on agriculture, right? Especially in Iowa, in kind of the heart of the Corn Belt. We spend a lot of money subsidizing the current system and trying to, help farmers deal with the vagaries of markets and disasters and so forth. My feeling is that we need to look for ways to use that money more wisely and try to, as Gene pointed out, to try to figure out ways to change the system to a more resilient one with perhaps more extended rotations, grazing and perennials on, land that probably shouldn't be row cropped. And in order to get to a place like that, I think we're going to have some major state and federal help. And also, it's hard when you start talking about system change, it's hard to try to really figure out where that's going to come from. But I think we're going to have major federal and state support for shifting our cropping systems, our agricultural systems to be more resilient, because it's not going to happen. The status quo is the status quo because it's got a lot, markets are set up. I mean, we've come to the status quo over time because of federal policy, different kinds of subsidies, different kinds of state policies, different kinds of crop insurance schemes that have really brought us to where we are. It's not just happened in some sort of natural economic evolution, right? It's, policies that have put in place to support our, shift to major, commodity production. In order to move us to someplace else, it's not going to happen naturally either. We're going to have to make some choices as society. That's kind of a long answer, and it's a hard answer, but I do strongly believe that to get to a more resilient place, we're going to have to take a good hard look at our cropping systems and think about how can we make them more diverse and more resilient. And that's going to take some doing, and it's going to take some, some interested actors might have to give some things up. Not what the impacts of that won't be felt equally. But I don't know. I mean, I'm probably talking too much, but I feel like, that a lot of the parts of the system right now are not very good for farmers in rural communities, and they're, kind of tilted toward agribusiness. So if we could figure out ways to tilt agriculture back more to people and planet, I think we'd be in a better place. I might get in trouble for that, but that's how I feel. I believe the science also backs that up.
We're all friends here.
It's a shocking comment when one of your larger corn and bean producers sits there and, as we look around, says, I think we've plowed up too much of this land. But they're starting to think that, at least some.
Yeah. But I think it's really hard for farmers to imagine something different right now, because, we talk to farmers about extending rotations, and they recognize the benefits of planting a small grain and, in terms of, increasing soil health and breaking pest and weed cycles. They understand very well, but they're like, what am I going to do with it? I mean, and I think in Wisconsin, probably you have a little bit more, leeway that way. You have more diverse agriculture, perhaps more markets. But here in Iowa, like, I feel like the I feel like the imagination and the capacity to imagine something different has kind of been squeezed out of us over time. But I think there's a hunger for something different and a hunger for something creative and, you know, that builds soil rather than degrades it.
We do have a question here from Kevin. Kevin Shelley, do you mind if I read it, or can you just ask it?
I actually can see it. Is this the one about the trusted source for climate change relative to others? Okay, yeah, so the question is, you show that extension is a trusted source for climate change of info relative to others. I believe you emphasized the local nature of that educational resource. Wisconsin is considering moving to a more regional level of local educators from the county model. Would you expect that model to compromise this type of confidence from farmers? I believe Iowa moved to a regional model years ago. That's a really good question. You know, I think certainly trust is built through relationships. A couple of people, I think, was it Mike? Everybody that's Jane, you also mentioned, and Gene too. I mean, trust is built through relationships, right? And relationships are easier to build locally. I mean, here in Iowa, we've switched to that regional model, and we still, you know, our field specialists do the best they can to get around, and they're doing more, you know, they're trusted, right? But they don't have as much contact with farmers as the ag retailers do, right? I'll never forget one time, not too long ago, I took a combine ride in north central Iowa with an extension friend of mine. Set me up with a combine ride, and we were just sitting there and got down from the combine, and then the Monsanto rep came by with a cooler of sodas and water and a bunch of Snickers bars, and he's like, "Oh, I was just in the neighborhood. See what you're doing. How's the harvest going?" So because he knew when the harvest would be. There are just so many more private sector folks out there building those relationships. When we only have one extension educator or one field agronomist for a 9-county area, there's just no way we can be there at harvest time to bring a cooler full of water and some Snickers bars. And yeah, so I mean, local is best, right? But resource limitations. I don't know what more to say about that, Kevin, but I see where you're going with that question, and I agree with you. I wish we had more extension folks.
Well, from the survey results, it seems like it's overcomable. And I mean, I don't think we're thinking about going too drastic, but it's just something. I don't know. It triggered a thought when you talked about that. So.
I mean, I think this is one of the really important silver linings of the pandemic, is that where all of us and farmers and everybody is getting much more comfortable with being online in a forum like this, right? And there's so many like Iowa Learning Farms, and I'm sure Wisconsin Extension, you've been doing the same things, just figuring out creative ways to get your information out there, and you're probably getting more eyes on your information now than you did before. I mean, I know here in Iowa, we're getting, whether it's Extension or Practical Farmers of Iowa or Iowa Learning Farms, the people are coming from all over the place. We're getting 150 people where we used to get 30 people. So maybe we can really kind of build on what we've been building over this last year to try to have stronger reach, even though we're fewer. If we can, if we've got the information and we've got the trust that's indicated, we just have to figure out how to get eyeballs and get that, whether it's virtual or in person, but, reach more people and keep building that trust maybe in different ways.
Thanks.
Wonder if anyone from the group has a question here that they would like to share. I've got one that I've been kind of trying to notice and pay attention to, and I don't know if you have any research to talk about it, but oftentimes in casual conversations, you will hear some farmers or dealers or whatever say, well, we're going to have better production now, we can take advantage of. They're not trying to be flippant or anything. They're just saying we got to be ready for some opportunities here. And I'm curious if there's a continuum of that. Sometimes as agricultural educators, we have to rise to that occasion too. So
is that a question for me or kind of
yeah,
general?
kind of. Yeah, I want to.
Well, I mean, certainly. I mean, that's like I mentioned in my presentation. You know, agriculture is all about adaptation, and yeah, maybe there are more opportunities. But I would just say let's figure out ways that those opportunities can lead to more resilient systems, both from a agroecological perspective, but also from a social perspective. If there are, if there's, it gets getting warmer in northern Wisconsin, maybe there are some more options open, or if it's, maybe now we can plant cover crops in northern Iowa, or farmers might think, oh, well, now I can plant cover crops in northern Iowa. So I guess, yeah, we always have to be ready to adapt, but let's always keep our eye on kind of social and agroecological resiliency.
I sure appreciate how you bring, you say social and ecological resiliency as in addition to economic. Very good. Thank you.
Well, one thing I would share, I mean, this is kind of on the same theme of trying to make our both the social and the economic and the ecological dimensions of our agriculture more robust. So I've asked a question in the farm poll now several times. It's a series of questions on ag policy and ag economics. And there's one question that I've asked now 3 times, or it's 2 items, and it's on an agreement scale. And the item is something along the lines of the shift from diversified operations to specialized commodity production has been good for Iowa farmers. And so, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And I've asked that now 3 times, and the percent of farmers that agree with that statement has declined each time. In the most recent year, only 13% of farmers agreed that the shift from diversified systems to specialized systems has been good for Iowa farmers. And I asked the same question about Iowa's rural communities. So the shift from diversified systems to specialized commodity production has been good for Iowa's rural communities. The agreement to that has declined from, I think, 14% in, I think the first year was 2009, to in 2020, just 9% agreed with that statement. So this tells me that farmers understand that this incessant move toward, specialized commodity production has not been good for farmers as a collective and has not been good for rural communities as a collective. So I think we really just have to, keep that in mind, is when we think about how we're going to build resilience into the system, we have to think about, the agronomic, the ecological, and the social all as one, because it all fits together. And if it doesn't, when we take our eye off any one of those, then we end up kind of in a place where our rural communities are in decline and our farm numbers are declining and smaller farms can't survive. And yeah, sorry, that was a downer.
I have if there's time, I have a question, which is I'm wondering can you see any connections between anything else and where you have farmers who are interested in adapting to climate change or acknowledge that it's human caused? Is there any correlation with location in the state or the type of farming they do or membership in an organization?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So definitely there's geographic variation in, concern and, beliefs and attitudes. And so the 5,000 farmer survey that I shared, I just didn't have time to share some of the data from that. But there are, if you go on the sustainablecorn.org website, there's a bunch of presentations there. But there's one map that I put up that shows, from say, there's a kind of a conglomerate attitudes and concern measure that I put together that shows there's where there's more vulnerability, there's more concern for sure. So like the Platte River Valley in Nebraska is where the lowest levels of concern were, because they've got good, strong irrigation and they're very flat. But then, like in is it the Black Root that's in the south? It's like the southwest Wisconsin, where it's kind of in the driftless area. I think it's Black Root watershed. So we stratify by watershed. So I think it's called the Black Root watershed in southwest Wisconsin.
Black Earth Creek?
Maybe.
Black Earth.
Black Earth, perhaps. But, so a lot of concern there. And then in the western Lake Erie Basin, where they're, having issues with nutrient loss into the Lake Erie around Toledo, they're concerned for a different set of, there's a different set of vulnerabilities to those farmers, right? They're vulnerable to regulation. So yeah, a lot of variation across the landscape, and at least what we can see is it has to do with, both ecological, biophysical factors like the actual vulnerability of the land, but also kind of vulnerability to social situations. And that's something that we need to dig into more, for sure. It's hard to tease that out, but we're working on it.
Thanks.
That's an awesome question.
Last call for questions, anyone? I want to thank you all for being here, and especially Jay for spending some extra time with us. I think we could spend much more time because as agronomists, we have to think about this stuff. So
yeah, no, this was fun. I really appreciate being asked to join you, and it's great excellent questions. Really,
yeah.
that was fun.
Thank you. All right, everyone.
This was
Have a
helpful.
great afternoon.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right, thanks.